Hi, good afternoon. It's nice to see so many of you here. I'm sorry that, I'm happy that our new audience members are here. This morning there was quite a bit of history, and I'm not a historian, I'm a religious studies kind of, professor. So you may, I hope I don't refer too quickly to anything that's out of historical context, but we'll give it a run. My field is Islamic studies, Islamic normative tradition. Of course, I have had experience on the ground in Turkey, and I teach a class called Women, Gender, and Embodiment in Islam. And that reminds me to mention, I'm sorry I didn't realize that you might want a kind of sheet with bibliography or filmography, but I'd be happy to prepare one later and send it to Zinta to send out if that turns out to be something that you would like. So I'm hoping to make this presentation, only take up part of the time, so you have time for questions. And I was joking with Hilmi before, and I said, oh, I don't see any Turkish women here. So that means that whatever I say is kind of the word, right? Because if any of the Turkish men disagree, we just say, well, that's because they're men. So this is actually adapted from a slide I use when I'm teaching about women and gender in Islam. So this is kind of broadly about saying anything about women and gender in Islam, but a lot of these categories could also apply to saying anything about women and gender in Turkey. And that's always remember diversity, right? Which women or which men, where are they? Especially in Turkey, you have a huge difference. I mean, people from the United States might not usually think about it that way, and I know probably a lot of you are well-traveled, but just to give a sense, many societies in the developing world, there's a huge difference between the urban experience and the rural experience. So the expectations of gender and gender norms and roles in a rural village Turkey are generally very different than they are in Istanbul. And of course, something that's been going on in Turkey over the past 20 years or so is a huge migration into the cities in search of labor or increased access to education and so on. So that there's also a certain sense of an importation of some rural traditions and rural expectations in the cities today. So sometimes you'll hear a critique from let's say Turkish women who are very urbanized, secular and liberal, saying, well, these movements that are trying to make the society more conservative, it's because those rural folks are moving in and voting. And that's not entirely the case, but there is that, let's say, kind of, things are shifting. So even that dichotomy of rural and urban, all of a sudden the urban is also becoming rural in certain segments, and then there's obviously some negotiation on both sides of that boundary. Now the Shias, let me first mention, okay, I'm starting off with kind of Islamic normativity and diversity. Of course, since the 1920s, as you learned this morning, Sharia, Islamic law, is not the law of the land in Turkey. So we really don't have to run through a checklist of Quranic or Islamic laws. But you could say that there is a kind of voluntary compliance in the Turkish population to some of the Islamic norms. So in fact, they will play out. And so then you have a kind of voluntarism, right? So it might be very relevant to talk about Islamic norms about gender for some in the Turkish population, and others could just say, like, why are you even talking about it? Turkey is a secular state. So I think that also creates an interesting dynamic. Now, the Sunni and Shia thing, of course, there is the Alevi population in Turkey. So Sunni and Shia law and gender is different, and actually, if I just kind of one-liner, I think the Alevi population in Turkey, Alevi, which is closer to Shia, would be perceived in general as being fairly liberal along gender roles. And then again, it's rural, urban, and so on. In contrast to Iran. So I'm thinking, many Americans would have the perception, oh, the Shia are more conservative because you have Iran and the Islamic theocracy. Well, it doesn't kind of work out that way in Turkey. So I say something about the diversity of women, Turkish women. You do have ethnic diversity within Turkey. So you have Kurdish women, and again, you have many Kurdish women living in Istanbul, and you have Turkish women in eastern Turkey, the rural poor villages. So it's not, I think it would be pretty hard to say, to say ethnicity is a determining factor in gender difference, but it's more the rural and urban context. And of course, most Turks are Muslim, but there are religious minorities. And then interpretive diversity. As in any religious community, you may have liberals and conservatives, and that may play out through the performance of gender roles, or you may have Sufi women. And I actually looked on the web and found a survey, where Muslim Turks describe themselves as either being very observant of religion, aspiring to be more observant, non-observant, or atheistic, in the population. And according to that fairly recent survey, 40% of Muslim Turks said they were non-practicing of religion. So again, to what extent is Islam a factor? And of course, culture, right? So a lot of things that go on, and often you'll have a kind of pushback. Okay, gender is an edgy subject, right? It can be very controversial. So I'll give a controversial, maybe give you an example. It's coming in my head. I have to say it. Honor killing. Right, so the honor killing thing, right? First of all, it's a perception that comes up about, Turkey, that's where they do honor killings, as in many Middle Eastern, societies that may come up. Now, of course, you get then one response, insider response would be, well, if that happens at all, it's culture. It has nothing to do with religion, which in fact is kind of legally true. I mean, there's nothing in Islamic law that would suggest that a family could take it into their own hands, or a community, to do something like that. And by the way, I will say a little bit more about that later, but I wanted to use that as an example to sort of play the religion and culture. So a lot of the gender norms or the performance of culture in Turkish society are not explicitly related to religion, but religion is a part of culture. But then there are certain things that for one reason or another somebody would want to distance from religion. And some of that might be apologetic, some of that might be factual, some of that might be hair-splitting. So gender's contested, right? It brings up contestations about identity and insider and outsider, and insider diversity about how gender is performed. So Turkish history and how I would play gender through that in 2 minutes. Well, there's kind of in the Republican period, there was a Turkification of Turkish culture, right? A kind of separating out of some of the Islamic elements. So again, you get this kind of religion and culture thing playing out with, for example, the Turkish language being reformed away from Persian and Persian and Arabic. So not going to write Turkish in the Arabic alphabet anymore. We're going to do away as much as possible with those Arabic words, and we're going to find Turkish words to say the same thing. And where do you go for that? Old Turkish odes and ballads and folklore. So there's this idea of kind of the Ur-Turk, the Uz-Turk, as the normative cultural Turkishness, as a kind of ethnic marker. So you have these kind of nomadic Turks, and I'm going to show you an image in a minute. But I would say the perception and the Republican Turkish projection of what that Turkish nomadic identity was that women had a pretty high status. The nomadic Turks, these women were tough. Women warriors or shaman. Women shamans, so it's kind of a positive alternative, which goes in parallel with the kind of Republican idea of the Turkish liberated woman. So the modern Turkish woman who's liberated, that resonates with the way Turks have always been. So that's gender, and then of course men, because when I talk about gender, I do like to talk about men, and at the end I'll say something about Turkish masculinity. So this isn't just about women, because to perform, the female role is also a performance of the male role. So the male role in old Turkish society is the male warrior, and he's tough and chivalrous, and maybe also plays music. There's a lot of images. There's this famous Turkish kind of epic, the Book of Dede Korkut. And if you look at the images, sometimes he's like playing music, and sometimes he's on a horse with a big hat. And so you know, there's a complexity to the masculinity. It's not just the warrior. Just as you have, let's say, the male Sufi, you know, who often is to some extent feminized or able to appreciate beauty. So then in the Ottoman Empire, well, we heard about that for hours. So how do you talk about gender? Well, of course, again, what pops into your head when you think gender, Ottoman Empire? Harem, right? So we saw the harem. So we'll talk about, talk a little bit about harems and how gender might play out there. And then the Republican period, just as you have a kind of explicit project of constructing a new Turkish identity in the new Turkish state, so you have a project of constructing new gender roles, and especially the kind of liberation and modernization of the Turkish woman. So I promised I'd show you my image. And then my image, you may have noticed I'm probably the only non-Turkish presenter today. So my image is also kind of filtered through an outsider's view, right? So let's say when I'm in Turkey looking at Turkish television or movies or so on, the kind of images I think of when I think of that old Turkish going to the past are this, you know, like the cover of a book or a TV movie of these kind of strong, you know, women warriors, and sort of anticipating the modern liberated Turkish woman. And that I actually cribbed this from somebody else's presentation of Ottoman women's costume in the 18th century. So a difference between the inner world of the, let's say, the harem, because harem not only, you know, it conjures up the idea of the sultan with lots of concubines and so on, but there was also traditionally a kind of division in the Turkish household, right? The male realm and the female realm, which does come out of Islamic norms and Islamic law, so that sort of homosocial society. In other words, men socialize with men and women socialize with women, and that was the traditional pattern. And also the distinction between public and private space, which was marked for women in particular, right? In Islamic norms, which carries over into classical Turkish culture, a woman who goes out into public space would normally be, this is like in the old pre-modern period, right? I'm talking about pre-modern period. The woman would be accompanied by a male, her mahram, a close male relative, or maybe in the old days a male servant or something. And she would be wearing a more enveloping clothing because she's in the public space. That would be the cultural expectation. Now, how does that continue to play out in the modern period? Well, of course, with the new laws, women weren't supposed to wear veils or cloaks or yashmaks or those, you know, enveloping things out in the public space anymore. I'll show you an image of that later. But I think you still would find in many segments of society women tending to socialize with women more so. Again, exception, you know, the big cities, the more secularized populations. And of course, within the family, you'd have mixing of males and females. But I think it's also quite dramatic for men, you know, sort of the image of Turkish men in a coffee house playing backgammon or something, you know, and traditionally it was all men, right? You wouldn't expect a woman to walk into the coffee house where the guys are playing backgammon. Well, that kind of changes somewhat over time. But I would say there's still a kind of men hanging out with men and women hanging out with women socially would be normative in many parts of Turkey and Turkish societies. And this is, again, done by a European artist, but a portrayal of the harem in the Topkapı in the early 1800s. But not sensationalized, right? There's a lot of discussion and critical theory about, you know, the outsider kind of perceiving the harem as a place of sexual fantasy and so on, whereas in many homes it was simply where the women lived. Of course, in the case of the rulers, they did in fact have multiple wives, and there was a whole kind of harem culture where a slave girl who enchanted the sultan and bore a son could, rise to the highest heights and even become the mother of the next sultan. So there was, in fact, if you read the Ottoman history, a lot of intrigue and poisonings and so on. So some of, again, this kind of tension between this exoticization of the harem. It seems that historically some pretty exotic things went on, but maybe not as sexualized as some of the art. This is a photograph of the Topkapi harem, which you can visit in Istanbul. The rooms and see the very elegant and beautiful surroundings that the women and children and female relatives. So it would be like a huge household in Islamic tradition, and therefore into Turkish culture. The male is responsible for taking care of all of the female relatives. So any female relatives whose husbands had passed away or who had been divorced and so on would kind of join the big extended family. So you could imagine even in the non-sultan big households. And then we move along a little bit more up to the 19th century, and these are some examples of women's dress in the Ottoman period for a woman going outside, right? So a difference in women's performance of gender in terms of dress from the outside realm. Oh no, my parents, something bad happened. The thing is going on. No, this isn't the slide. I didn't press the wrong thing. Okay. I understood. I don't know what to do. Did that happen before? Yeah. Okay. I don't know, a glitch. Well, you can still kind of see. So this is just an image I liked. This woman writer, Halide Edip Aldevar, whose life kind of spanned the transition from the late Ottoman into the Republic and modern period, is an example of this, a very cultivated woman literary figure. And this is a picture of her when she's very young, with the kind of, upper class woman's kind of delicate veil. And then into the period when women no longer had to veil, or maybe at home shot, because I'm thinking she looks pretty young there. And she continued to be a writer and novelist, and writing about Turkish history and women's issues. So there certainly are many examples. Oh, I feel like we skipped a slide. How do I go back? Women in the Turkish Republic. Yeah, one more. I think there's something. Yeah, I think this. There we go. Sorry, there was always something weird about this slide. Okay. So this is in the Republic period. Remember, you have the reform of women's dress, and I don't want that. Okay, it wasn't doing that before. Okay, so you had a reform of you had the banning of the veiling, and in fact, this image is one of 3 Turkish parliamentarians. So you see this very fast movement of women into the public sphere. What is it still doing? Just skip that. That's good. Keep going. It's okay. Go to the next one. And the next one. That's like a dummy slide.
One more?
Yeah, one more. So now we're, just a very quick, sidebar on Turkish women in politics. This is Roxolana here, the wife. I was talking about harem intrigue. She was the favorite of Suleiman the Magnificent, and he married her, which was exceptional in the case of the concubines in the harem. And then she became a great power behind the throne during that period. So you have this kind of the women as the power behind the throne, right, in the Ottoman period. And then here you have Tansu Çiller, an elected woman prime minister of Turkey. So, the kind of maybe you can play on this in different ways, right? Power in the contemporary period in Turkish society. Of course, there are many women parliamentarians and politicians in Turkey, and it even became acceptable in Turkey to have a female head of state before it did in the United States. So you can see, that, which actually you find in a number of Muslim societies, but what's exceptional about Chile is most of the women heads of state in Muslim societies were the widows or wives or daughters of male politicians who kind of built on their charisma, whereas in Turkey, she kind of did it on her own. Oh yeah, this is the slide I want next, sorry. Now this film, has anyone ever seen, aside from our Turkish friends, anyone ever seen the film Yol? This is a little edgy because this is a film that maybe not all Turkish people really like. But I like it. It was made in the 1980s by a leftist Kurdish filmmaker who actually had to flee Turkey. It was like strict military rule. And he had the film shot by friends and like other people in Turkey under him. He directed the film, but he wasn't physically there. But in this film, it kind of is his take on what he found oppressive about Turkish society during his period. So it's 30 years old. So this is like the old problems of gender, and I want to talk about some of the old problems of gender in a Kurdish rural context, right? That's what this film was about. And then what does that kind of look like, those issues look like today in a more broad context. But these various images remind me of some of the subplots of the film, which is about 5 Turkish prisoners who are released for a holiday furlough. In other words, these kind of prisoners were allowed to sort of go home for a week, visit their family, and then they have to come back to the prison, okay? So there's a story about each one of them, and many of the stories involve gender issues. Like you see one man who's walking with his fiancée and he's telling her, like, when we got married, you never talk back to me. When we get married, so sort of the construction of the patriarchal, marriage. And how does, okay, so that's in the film. Then there's the issue, this Turkish man goes back to his tribe, which is fighting on the Syrian border. They're smugglers and the Turkish state is trying to shut them down. His brother is killed in a raid, and he has to marry his brother's wife and take care of the kids because that is the custom in their tribe, okay? So again, gender. It's another guy, his wife was unfaithful to him. And even worse than that, apparently she worked in a brothel while he was in prison. So the family says he's got to kill her. And so he's like taking her and their child, walking through the snow, and he can't sort of bear to do it. And the plot is kind of resolved because she dies out in the snow, so he didn't have to kill her. But the plot is the honor-killing motif. And then there's one man who's on his furlough, and he goes to a brothel. And so all those issues are kind of on the table, and all those are, of course, very sensitive issues about gender, and maybe not what every Turkish person would like you to think of when you think about gender in Turkey. But obviously, these were real social problems that exist, as some of them exist in any society. Some of them are particular to a conservative rural background. So I want to talk about some of those things in updates. Well, nowadays honor killings are illegal in Turkey explicitly, and they're prosecuted, okay? Now part of that, I think you learned this morning about the entry to the EU, and that many things were being tightened up and brought up to, let's say, EU human rights standards. So there's still, a strong critique. The women's movement, feminist movements in Turkey are saying, no, it's illegal, but people are sneaking around it by trying to say these women committed suicide. We have to investigate these cases. So it's still, bubbling there as a strong critique. Not to say it's a big practice or lots of people, but let's say it's a social issue, right? Social issue that's being addressed and talked about. Then gay rights, again with the EU standards, there's no law in Turkish law against being homosexual. There may be social stigma, especially depending where and what part of Turkey, and then there's also gay rights organizations in Turkey as well, right? So you have this huge contrast across the country between the sort of most modern liberal attitudes, and then if you're in a rural area, it may be different. And prostitution, as in the film, you know, what was probably surprising to maybe an American audience is that prostitution is regulated by the state. You know, kind of seeing, yeah, this is not a good thing that happens in society, but if it's going to happen, people should be tested for STDs on a regular basis, and better to control it, and better to make it difficult for it to come into the country. So, you know, let's say it's a social issue that has to do with gender. Now, something I didn't have time to put on the slide, but I thought I wanted to talk about is women's leadership in religion. That actually you have more Turkish women assuming official religious roles, becoming state-certified preachers and religious teachers. And it's kind of an ironic byproduct. The Turkish government wanted to kind of keep a lot of people from going to madrasas and religious schools, so they opened up university faculties of theology. And those faculties of theology were open to women. So it turns out that a lot of women started getting degrees in Islamic theology. And then, you know, they wanted to have jobs, and then the jobs are not like gender restricted. So a woman can get a job as a female preacher. Now, she doesn't get up and lead the Friday prayers or preach from the pulpit, but she has a teaching role. She takes groups of women on the Hajj. So, you know, the projection would be that in the future, you'd have more woman-friendly interpretations of Islamic tradition and Islamic law. And in fact, you may have heard, and you can Google it to get more information about the Hadith Reform Project. There's a kind of sympathy to what you might call liberal or reformist Islamic thought in Turkey. So some of the Hadith, these parts of Islamic tradition that are sayings of Prophet Muhammad, some of the Hadith are sort of controversial from a gender equitable point of view. And so there's a project sponsored by the Ministry of Religious Affairs to kind of go through those books, and not to throw them out or say they're wrong, but maybe to marginalize some of these sayings that no longer jive with a contemporary idea of gender. That for some reason, the only example that comes into my head is a saying that a man's prayer is invalidated if a black dog, a donkey, or a woman walks in front of him. Now, again, it's not like people are thinking about this a lot or keeping track or something, but you know, just the fact that those kind of things are on the book, you know, on the books, some would say, well, you know, what does that say about? So you have a calling into question of some of those norms. So let me move along here. This was actually a picture on Time magazine. Some of you may remember a while ago, I don't know, 2002, 2003, they were talking about women in Islam. And one of the pictures was Turkish schoolgirls, and the drama of this image, in contrast to some of the other images they had, was that these women were very obviously unveiled, as many women in Turkey are. And that brings us up to the headscarf issue, which is one of the controversial issues that has to do with gender. You may know that in the 1920s there was a ban on the veil. Ban on, you know, well, what exactly does that mean? Well, as you saw, you know, there was even a face veil in the Ottoman period. But the headscarf in Turkey, sometimes, you know, there are different styles of headscarves in their meaning. Now, I had a prop here. There was a scarf here. Did it fall down? The charger. Oh yeah. Okay. This is a prop. You know, show and tell. This is like a rural, kind of a folk, you know, version of the scarf, and women crochet these borders. So a woman wearing this kind of scarf, people say like she's from the village, or you know, babushka, or you know, it's quaint. It's not threatening. But the modern day kind of international hijab, you know, the transnational woman's headscarf, that's considered to be sort of subversive. So women wearing this kind of scarf were not allowed to be teachers in schools or attend universities. And so this has been kind of a litmus test, you know, a flashpoint in the society, like really out of proportion. So the current government tried to remove the ban in 2008. And it was just too politically risky, because there are forces in the society that might say you're trying to make Turkey into Iran, so they had to back off. So right now it's kind of an almost don't ask, don't tell. Well, of course, you don't have to ask, you see the woman in the headscarf. But more women tend to be allowed, or actually at Boğaziçi University, which is the American influenced top university in Istanbul, you'd see women, for example, who'd be wearing the scarf, but on top they'd be wearing a baseball cap. So it would be kind of a way to maybe blunt the, so then it's okay. So you have all those kind of permutations. Now quickly, I want to say something, and if I have time I'll show a video clip, otherwise I may just recommend it. Turkish masculinities is something interesting to talk about, and of course masculinity studies is a kind of a growing field in critical theory. So how is masculinity constructed? And I'll just give two examples. Is the a circumcision ritual is a male rite of passage, and the symbolism around it as constructing a certain kind of male Turkish ideal. And then military service, because Turkey is a country that has compulsory military service for males only. So I mean, that's already gendered. And it's kind of a long-term thing. It's what, 6 to 18 months? And every Turkish male has to do it. So it's like this male bonding thing. It's kind of a social equalizer, but it's obviously a militarization of the culture as well through this experience. So male circumcision in Turkey occurs at a relatively late age, like 7 to 13. So the boy is kind of conscious. It's a rite of passage. Now you're going to become a man. You shouldn't cry. And you dress up in these kind of quasi-military uniform. So again, it's associated with kind of, maleness. Now you're going to be an adult male. You're going to be tough. And it's very public. So your masculinity, in a very embodied physical way, is something that is not shameful in public. In contrast to a woman's femininity, her charms, which culturally, traditionally, should not be exposed in public. And you can imagine there's a lot of anthropological literature on that kind of thing. So masculinity in the military is very much linked to nationalism, and you have had in Turkey kind of hyper-nationalism, right, since the Republican period, and this can be a very robust kind of masculine thing where the soldier's role to the homeland is like a man's role to women, and a kind of protectionist discourse. And this is actually a picture of Turkish soldiers celebrating the soccer team, sort of robust, masculine Turkish soccer team in the World Cup. And that's kind of my brief review of gender. Now I have shall we show a bit of the, is that okay? And then we could still have enough time for questions. I don't know, have any of you seen or used the video Frontline? Muslims Frontline. There's a very interesting segment that's excellent to use in your classes. You want to start it? It goes around the world, but there's a section on Turkey that deals with some of the topics I've done, and I may not be able to play the whole thing, but just, and you want to enlarge it.
To better understand the tension between East and West, we've come here to Istanbul, Turkey, a city straddling both Europe and Asia. Istanbul has a rich Islamic past. Until 1922, it was the center of the last great Islamic empire of the Ottomans. But 80 years ago, Kemal Ataturk became the first leader of a Muslim people to believe that in order to modernize, Islam's influence on society had to be crushed.
Governments which ruled Muslims were very often, like colonial governments, they suffocated Muslims. They suffocated those who wanted to go back to their original culture. With all due respect to Kemal Ataturk in Turkey, I mean, this man is attempted to suppress Islam.
Under Ataturk, Friday ceased to be a public holiday and mosques emptied. Sharia law was replaced by Western legal codes. Islamic scholars were forced to submit to state control. Arabic script was replaced by the Latin alphabet. and Turks were sent back to school to learn it.
All the history of modernization was written in a way which excluded Muslim culture. So in order to be modern, especially in the Turkish case, we had to get away from our Muslim background.
With his power as president and dictator, he begins his reform. He commands young Turks to go to business school. He brings in foreigners to show girls how to dress, how to manage their homes the European way. Into European dress, he forces both men and women, sweeping away the veil and the fez.
For several decades, it seemed as if Ataturk's reforms could succeed. By the 70s, Turkey had become one of the most westernized countries in the region and an active member of NATO. But at the same time, rapid urbanization was changing Turkey's cities. A free market economy had increased inequality, and voters were frustrated at what they saw as corruption within the political system. Many Muslims began to question Ataturk's belief that Islam should be removed from politics.
This desire to talk about politics as being separate from Islam is something that Muslim scholars on the whole have never accepted. Why? The Prophet Muhammad was a prophet and a statesman.
So pro-Islamic politicians promised to rectify a split that they saw as artificial. Turkish secular author Theology.
It is very easy to use religion in Turkey, in other Muslim countries, as part of Turkey is very poor, and then they just believe that if the Muhammad Prophet time comes back again, they will be prosperous. And this is what they claim.
By 1996, the Turkish Islamic Party had gained enough popularity to win over 20% of the national vote and came to power in a coalition government. In response, secular officials clamped down on Islam's most visible symbols. These women became victims of a crackdown on the headscarf, which was banned from all public institutions.
I was studying here, this university. For 3 years I studied at the Department of Physics. But the 4th year I couldn't enter because of my headscarf. They said us, you are covering your head with hijab, with scarf. You couldn't enter this university. But I studied with my headscarf for 3 years. Yeah, this building is the library of Istanbul University, and we can't with our headscarf, even in a library, we can't go, we can't enter, we can't search in there.
If we allow the girls to cover their heads, one day we would be forced to cover our heads as well. We were frightened that if we had allowed them, they would turn Turkey into Iran.
Herhangi bir partinin de, herhangi bir siyasi...
The headscarf isn't an object that represents a political party or a movement.
Onun propagandasını yapacak herhangi bir...
In my opinion, it's not an instrument of propaganda.
Benim için...
For me, the headscarf is about being religious and is a symbol of Islam.
İslam'ın bir göstergesidir.
I am not dangerous. I wasn't dangerous and I'm not dangerous.
The vice rector of Istanbul University played a central role in enforcing the headscarf ban. She is a researcher.
It was not only a matter of headscarf. With the headscarf, many other things have started to take place at the universities. For example, the students, they didn't want examinations or classes on Fridays. There are many mosques around Istanbul University, but students, instead of going to mosques, they wanted to do their praying at the corridors. And they published some magazines saying that they are coming to the university to fight for an Islamic state. So day by day, these demands increased. And of course, afterwards, some limitations took place.
Yasak ilk başladığında
When the band started, I was in my 4th year of medical school.
ve ilk başladığında ilk
On that day, just as I went into class and sat in my chair, my teacher came over and told me I had to leave.
bir de ben de
For half an hour or so, I tried talking to him, but they called the police.
çağırdı.
They grabbed me and carried me out.
The police moved in to break up the demonstrations.
Okay, in the interest of leaving you guys max time to ask questions, I'm going to stop there, but it goes on talking somewhat more about Turkey and the story. There was a Turkish parliamentarian, a female who wore the headscarf, who was elected, and when she went to sit in parliament, they wouldn't let her take her seat and they removed her Turkish citizenship. So it talks about how hot that issue was. Now, of course, that was 2001, 2002, that film. So since then, things have moved towards the liberalization. But I think that gives you a sense of what an intense, kind of culture war issue and symbol that is in the Turkish society. And of course, it's a highly gendered symbol. And I think you also saw, even from the slides, like there's a visual message there, right? The women who are opposing, looking a certain way and, making certain claims about wanting Turkey to remain secular in a particular sense. And also you saw the students kind of gender segregating themselves, right? In the demonstration, the males are in one part and the females are in, so that's kind of another dynamic. So that's kind of my presentation, and I'll be happy to take questions, and I may not be able to answer them all, but I'll try as best I can. Yes, gentleman in the second row.
Yeah, this is a question that perhaps has been addressed earlier in the morning, but I wasn't here. In your experience, would you say Turks regard themselves as Europeans or Asians?
Well, that, and of course, I think the film was also nice in just setting up that one-liner at the beginning, right? Because of course Turkey straddles Europe and Asia, but I mean straddles, it's like that much of Turkey is in Europe, right? And I almost want to say I don't think maybe Turks identify themselves as either Asians or Europeans, but there's kind of a, for example, in Istanbul, you have this expression, the Asian side. And there's a sense of the Asian side as being, traditional, authentic, and the European side is both, of Istanbul proper, the big city, has a lot of different symbolic valences, right? So it's a kind of melting pot, it's cosmopolitan, it's progressive, it's exciting, but it's not maybe the real Turkey in a certain way. So I'd say the answer to that is it's complicated, but I don't think Turks, Ataturk was a Europophile, is that an expression? Because he'd served, as military attaché in Europe, and apparently he felt embarrassed by, remember we're talking about the 19-teens, so Turkish society at that time he saw as backward and kind of blamed culture, and he saw Europe as a beacon of the future, as did many Muslim intellectuals at that time. So you had the kind of modernism, right, which, it was his vision at that time, and it hasn't proved to be sustainable. So even, along with the veil and fez, it's very entertaining, I don't know the word for it, his reforms. Apparently he banned traditional Turkish music of a certain kind that he compared to sounding like the yowling of cats. And he said it would be better to have, European symphonies played. So obviously I don't think there are many Turks who would kind of buy into that kind of, again, what does it mean to be European today? And I think where you could take your question to a very interesting place would be the experience of the Turks in Europe now, the workers in Germany, and so on. So there might be times as a Turk in Germany that you want to kind of deploy your Europeanness, or you want to get into the EU, because that's your right as a European. So it's kind of strategic. No, it's postmodern, it's strategic. Turks can be European when it makes sense, and they have a right to be that. but they don't have to be like washed away by that. It's just an element of a pastiche postmodern identity. Yes?
There's an article in the Tribune not too long ago about the various Asian economies, and Turkey, I noticed, has one of the highest income per capita. And I know you're not an economist, but
I think there's an economist in the room.
Right
so.
here.
Well, and somebody who presented today. Yeah.
Well,
Okay, go ahead.
I'm just thinking that a lot of this conflict may be due to the fact that Turkey's been like the doorway to commerce between the East and the West, and isn't a significant amount of that income due to commerce with the West. And that causes a conflict because they need to cater to that economic program. But there's a Muslim Asian religion, which creates conflict.
Well, I think that might have been Ataturk's, way of seeing it, but I don't think the kind of Anatolian tigers, these Turkish businessmen from the heartland who are making textiles and furniture and so on, I don't think they see their textiles and furniture as, they're sort of materially neutral, they're kind of global. So I think Turkey has kind of moved beyond the East-West dichotomy, right? It's a global, and I think actually that's happening everywhere, right? If you look at these protests that are going on in Egypt and Tunisia and Libya. Now, I think there is still a peace that needs to be negotiated about the Islamic identity there, but it's pretty clear that this new kind of global thing that transcends an East-West, problematic. Maybe it's what kind of Muslim are you going to be in the modern period dynamic, but it's no longer, because there's no longer any East and West, right? Because the Turks are in Germany or, or here, or, that's kind of breaking down. That would be my take. Sorry, a non-economist, a cultural theory answer. Yes?
Is there any coalition of Turkish women with women in Egypt, for example, or Israel, for example, any kind of transnational women's movement?
Well, I mean, there's national and transnational feminist movements, and there's certainly a very lively Turkish feminist movement, and I do not know the specifics of collaboration, but there are obviously, I don't think that would be problematic at all. And of course, Turkey has had good relationships with Israel and with other, I would say maybe more so than with the Arab countries. I know maybe now there'd be more increased relationship with the Arab countries with the new developments. Sorry, I can't give a more detailed answer than that. Yes?
Is the counterpoint to male rites of passage, are there female rites of passage as well?
There's an interesting book about that by anthropologist Carol Delaney. She's a graduate of University of Chicago. And she has a book called The Seed and the Soil, which is about gender and the construction of gender in a Turkish village. And she also wrote 2 articles, one about menstruation and the symbolism of menstruation, and one about the symbolism of hair in Turkish society. The rite of passage for women seemed to be more marriage. And in this village, and again, this is, village Turkey in the 1980s, right? So it's not, but the sort of wedding night has various rites of passage, symbolism across Turkey. There's like the henna night and, the symbolism of the red henna, the bridal blood, anthropologists get into all of this. But the village Turkey in the 1980s, a lot of the symbolism of the preparing for marriage had to do with hair. And then the bride had her hair braided into these really long hair that she had never cut, and it was braided into these really, really tight braids with beads on them. And then I think there was some kind of ritual hair cutting. And then after the wedding, of course, she would wear the scarf. So there's kind of a covering and uncovering, which has to do with the public and private, and the female open head as being shameful. In fact, the word for uncovered hair means like open, açık. So open is kind of scandalous, right? You're not private. You could be available to any man. So it's kind of the converse of the symbolism of the male a circumcision where the male genitalia, I'm getting very Freudian here, but, you know, it's very, you know, sort of public, there's nothing shameful about it, whereas in the woman it's kind of the opposite, and so it's kind of the sexualized hair becomes the symbol of that rite of passage, that it must be covered because this should not be in a public. So marriage is probably, you know, the rite of passage, the prime rite of passage. And of course it's also important for men as well, but men also have the sunnet. Anyone Turkish want to intervene on that one? No. They're men, they don't dare. Any other questions?
So thank you, Dr. Hermansen.